Hey, how would you shut your mouth?
Good morning. Grace and peace to you from our God, who is our Creator, and who gives us promises of liberation and resurrection. Amen. In today's scripture of Exodus chapter 16, the Israelites have just been liberated from the labor of the Pharaoh's empire, a place in which they would receive meager daily rations beside the flesh pots of Egypt, in trade for the use and at times abuse of their own bodies and time for the economic growth of that empire. It's often said in tradition that the pyramids that we have seen, that some of you may have traveled to, were built by the Israelites themselves. The story of Exodus tells us that God hears the people's cries. And so he called Moses, this man who comes from two cultures, who was born as a Hebrew slave, and yet raised with the privilege of the Pharaoh's own son, to lead the people forth from oppression into liberation. After a series of plagues, which some of us might have seen in the movie 10 Commandments, or my favorite, the Disney Prince of Egypt, they begin to have a system taken down in which the Pharaoh is swayed to allow the people to be freed. And as they begin to leave Egypt and cross into this place of wilderness on the way to the promised land that God has told them will be theirs, a place of safety and shelter, of plenty of food and water, a place in which they will not have to labor for anyone but themselves. The Pharaoh changes his mind and sends his army after them. And so we know the story of the sea in which the people make it through. And yet, after all of this, for everything that God has done for them within months of liberation from slavery and time of traveling in the wilderness, the people are crying out to God with their complaints and their fears and concerns, scared for lack of food and water. They cry out to Moses, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us into this wilderness to kill this whole congregation with hunger. The stress and the chaos of life in the wilderness was so intense that they began to long for their former lives as slaves in Egypt. At least in Egypt, they had food and they had shelter, and they knew what the next day entailed. Things weren't uncertain. Out here in the wilderness, they don't know what's safe. They don't know how to procure their daily provisions or what the future may hold. Despite God's promise of liberation and a homecoming to the promised land in which there would be plenty for all, their fears spoke loudly within their hearts. And in their suffering, they are in the midst of a crisis of faith. And so they cry out to God and their leaders with bewilderment. I don't know about you, but that sounds awfully familiar to me these days in our own nation. We're not too far from the flesh pots of Egypt ourselves. We live in a new age of the Pharaoh's empire in which greed and hoarding and abuse of those below us in our economic system can run rampant. Similar to the Egyptian Pharaoh's empire, our own American empire pits God's children against one another and encourages the accumulation of power and wealth by saying that there is not enough to go around, and that some must be left out of the provision of basic needs so that others of us will have our share. And ultimately says not every life matters. In spite of abundance in this promised land, aplenty, our own fears of meeting our basic needs and protecting our own rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness can cause us to act as if we too are in a vast and chaotic wilderness. Out of our own fear, we may hasten community division, neighbor turning against neighbor, with distrustful and hateful rhetoric in our public sphere, or even between family members. A lack of ability to engage in conversation with civility or empathy, and legislation of state and federal policies that may promote the false appearance of liberty. Many of us are bewildered by today's times and wonder when this time of chaos, this time of harm of neighbor against neighbor will end. This week we again are processing the news of another mass shooting and domestic terrorist incident in our nation. And I don't know about you, but I'm questioning, where are you, God? Where is God's promise of presence and providence? We may wonder in our crying out, how does evil exist in our world? How could anyone be so cold-hearted, so evil, that he could murder his own neighbor? We may ask ourselves individually and societally, how such incidences of terrorism could be prevented in the future. We may wonder, are we complicit in this system of the empire somehow, in which power and wealth can seem to appear more important than addressing violence and the apathy that seemed to uphold it? How could we, as the American people, have prevented Las Vegas from joining the already too long list of the Pulse Nice Club, Sandy Hook Elementary School, Aurora, Colorado, Virginia Tech University, Charleston, South Carolina, and the list goes on and on and on. Why does it seem in America we have a problem with mass shootings that other developed nations lack? We may wonder, what does this mean for our Christian faith in times like these? How can we live in God's liberation rather than the slavery of the empire or the wilderness of chaos? Indeed, we are not too far from the flesh pots of nature. And yet, it's by those very flesh pots, it's in the midst of the wilderness that God hears the people crying out. God hears and God responds. Mirroring the creation story of Genesis chapter 1, God responds to the people's cries through the giving of manna to meet their basic needs. God promises to send them this special bread, this special food daily so that they will not go hungry, and thus institutes a new food practice of distribution, one in which all have enough to eat and none can hoard more than they need for a rainy day. God's desire for God's creation is clearly shown through this distribution of manna, as God shapes the people into a different kind of community, one that is different than they grew up with in the time of slavery, one in which God's dream is for that creation that God has made, all human life, all animal life, all plant life, in which people can live in true peace and justice and healing, in which basic needs are met and resources shared and distributed equitably. Even more, God sets aside time for the Sabbath, this special time mirroring God's own creation story, in which the people are to rest from their labors and the meeting of those basic needs. A time to be reminded of the value of life, and that life matters more than just being for labor itself. As the Hebrew Bible scholar Terry Fretheim states, God's new creation is much more than a spiritual matter. It's this comprehensive reality affecting change in every little nook and cranny of the world, including people's everyday needs. While the beneficiaries of today and long ago's political and economic systems tend to preserve their power and wealth by ignoring the cries and reality of many, the God of the Israelites, our God today, hears and responds to the people's cries and casts out God's vision and dream for God's creation, in which community may live together knowing this daily bread and gift of Sabbath, this value of human life, in which God claims again that, yes, indeed, everyone has been made in my image. I don't know about you, but even in the midst of that, I wonder, where is God right now? Where is God's hearing and response been this week to the persistence of gun violence in our nation? How could our all-loving, all-good, all-powerful God allow such violence to occur and damage the lives of so many? Whether it be the mass shooting in Las Vegas or the high rates of suicide by gun or domestic abuse. Why? Why is this continuing in our world today? Where are you, God? Where are you right now? As I've looked at the news this week, much like after other incidences of mass tragedy in our American history, I've been wowed by the countless stories of people and their responses in the wake of such tragedy. On Sunday evening, in response to the shooting, off-duty and on-duty police, firefighters, and EMTs swarmed to the Las Vegas Strip, looking to find where the shooter was and to target in and stop him from harming more people. Closing down the scene, directing citizens to safety, and providing that first response medical care. While some concert goers fled in all directions, just trying to find safety wherever they could, others stayed behind, serving as those first responders, placing their own hands as compresses into people's wounds and offering the words of encouragement and calm. Guests of the hotel rooms in that area on the Strip provided safe sanctuary to those who were fleeing, welcoming strangers that they did not even know into their room and saying, "You are safe here. We will shelter here together until we know what's going on." Assemblies of strangers gathered together across our nation to pray for those who died and to hope for those who survived. God heard the people's cries and sent these angels of mercy, of healing, and safety to those in jeopardy. For me, this is where I go for when I wrestle for those why questions. I remember that we are the ones who God has created and sent forth to be God's messengers of that hope and that peace, that we are God's response to the world's tragedies and crisis. And so the question that I've been asking myself this week is how could I, as a follower of Christ, continue to cast out God's vision of this holistic creation in which peace and healing and justice and liberation actually abide and win the day rather than harm and division. At the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, which is my favorite gospel, Jesus proclaims his mission statement loudly and clearly in front of his hometown congregation. Quoting the prophet Isaiah, Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Throughout all 4 Gospels, Jesus' ministry and teaching, death and resurrection, he faithfully follows this mission statement, one that for him summarized God's desire and hope for God's creation and people. For me, that's our mission statement too. As we follow Jesus, we're called to the same mission statement that he had his entire life bound up in. That God has sent you to be the one to release the captives, to bring the good news, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And so, as his followers, as God's angels and his messengers, his response to pain today, how are we going to bring that to one another? How are you going to live that out in your daily life? When will we set the captives free? When will we begin to cry out to our own leaders that every life is valuable and demand changes to the empire that say all lives matter? Others are not more important than others. Will we trust in God's providence of daily bread in the midst of the wilderness, rather than returning to the flesh pots of our fear in Egypt? Prayer without action is not enough. Now is the time for us to act, to be that bearer of God's good news of liberation. This week, I was reminded by one of our own congregation members of this need that prayer is not enough and that we need to be God's presence of hope in the world. After our Wednesday evening prayers around the cross worship service, in which we gathered for a time of prayer and lit candles, and those candles symbolizing, reflecting the prayers of all those who were gathered, this member took a picture of that candlelight and posted on her Facebook page with a quote from St. Francis of Assisi. "All the darkness in the world cannot extinguish the light from a single candle." All the darkness in the world cannot extinguish the light from a single candle. Can you imagine all the ways in which the light of Christ is and may be reflected through you and who you are and how you act out of liberating love and radical faithfulness to God's vision for creation? Can you imagine the world if all of our single candles were brought together? The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness shall never, never overcome it. Amen.
Amen.